Cynthia, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. It's always great to connect with you, Chris.
Yes, it's I think what last time we had a chance to chat was at Low Carb Denver, I think earlier this year, right? Was that the last event?
Yes, yes. It was funny. At low carb Denver, I was really struggling with the altitude to the point where, I mean, I couldn't drink enough water, couldn't drink enough electrolytes. I mean, I was watching my HRV tank on my Oura ring. And then I realized it's the darned altitude, even though I've been to Denver probably 30 times in my lifetime. But it's always good to see you and the rest of the bio coach team.
Yes, thank you. No, it was a really fun event. And I really like those like smaller ones like that where you just have like more of an opportunity to like connect with people. Like, I love going to the big events too, where you get to meet a lot of new people. But a lot of times I look at some of these conferences, the smaller ones like that, as like a reunion. It's like a chance to really get to like sit down and have some like good conversations with folks that, whether you've podcasted with them or worked with them in the past and stuff like that. It's just really nice to be able to do that. It sounds like you've been, kind of doing a lot of travel lately, which, I know, because the thing with Denver and the HRV and everything is that you're kind of getting hit both on those. You're traveling, which is also going to like tank your HRV. And then you're also, you're out at altitude, which is going to, harm it too. Do you have any like good like travel strategies or travel hacks that you use? Because I know you've kind of been out on the road a lot lately.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, first and foremost, hydration and electrolytes, notwithstanding, I have to actually double up on electrolytes. So instead of doing 3 packets a day of Element, I'm probably doing six. So that definitely helps when I'm traveling. And I also have mild dysautonomia. So for listeners to understand that, that means that my body, probably is the way God made me, it struggles a little bit with finding balance between the autonomic nervous system. So I tend to be a little sympathetic dominant. And so that travel piece added on with altitude really kind of throws things for a loop. I generally fast while I'm traveling. I think that's really helpful. I try to get on whatever time zone I'm flying to. So if I'm flying to the West Coast, I really will extend a fast so that I can get kind of on that schedule right away. I think it's also helpful to get morning light exposure. So I'm the crazy person that was walking around in LA, and it was actually cold in LA when I was there in April, to just to get some sunlight on my retinas to kind of, remind my body, let's suppress the melatonin, let's get some cortisol, elevated to kind of get us going. Um, I think it's important to exercise. I think that goes without standing. Like wherever I'm traveling to, I like to make sure I'm getting in my steps. I like to make sure I'm getting in and getting some lifting weights. Sometimes the time differences are to your advantage. So when I was up at 4 o'clock in the morning, Pacific Coast time, I might have looked crazy to the people up there, but it was 7 a.m., really on the East Coast. So I think part of it is, acclimating to the time difference. I do use melatonin when I travel.
Yeah.
In fact, I use it quite a bit because I'm just at a stage of life where my body actually makes less endogenous melatonin. But I also think, adding in adaptogens, so things like ashwagandha, rhodiola, which can be very kind of calming to that autonomic nervous system. And then the other thing is really being conscientious about macros. So for me, when I travel, it's like protein and veggies, and I do really well. I don't drink alcohol as a rule. It just doesn't serve me well. But I know for me, if I were to drink alcohol and be at altitude and be traveling, my HRV probably would have been even worse. So those are some things that I think are pretty reasonable for people to kind of think about while they're traveling. Obviously, it really depends. I tend to avoid airplane food. I tend to avoid airport food if unless I'm absolutely desperate. But I will always make sure I carry things like Paleo Valley beef jerky or like salted macadamia nuts. So if I do get hungry, I won't force myself to avoid eating if I'm hungry. But I think that those things have worked really well for me. And I tend to bounce around in different time zones pretty easily, thankfully. But I think a lot of that has to do with the fasting. I do think that kind of resetting that circadian clock can be very, very helpful in getting more acclimated.
Yeah, it's crazy that, I think for people who aren't as familiar with like some of the travel hacks, it may seem like, oh, is it really necessary to do all of those things? But like it really does make a big difference on just like the quality of your life for wherever you're traveling. Like if you're traveling for a vacation or something like that, rather than getting in and being groggy or in a bad mood or super anxious or anything like that, like doing these things can definitely help you just kind of hit the ground running, feel a little bit better, have more energy. I had a trip out to California last week where it was, from Florida to California. It was like a 36-hour trip, took like a red eye back. And, I was trying to pull out all the stops to try to like, really keep it dialed in. And it's tough. It's like, it's a lot on the body. I'm curious though for you, when you travel out and you're speaking at events, does that impact your like, that you're having this like kind of sympathetic response? Your HRV is a little bit more off. Do you feel that when you're speaking, where maybe you have a little bit more? And I don't know kind of what your stance is on public speaking, if that's something that comes easy to you or if it's something that's stressful. But do you feel that impact your public speaking at all, where you're maybe a little bit more anxious or jittery or anything up there?
I think it really depends on what the circumstances are. I think when I was in Denver, I wasn't getting restful sleep. So I can tell you the day that I spoke, instead of going out in the morning and listening to the speakers, I listened in my room because I acknowledged like I felt edgy. I could
Yeah.
tell that I felt edgy, and that's not my norm. So I typically, for me, the day that I'm going to speak, and I'm an introvert. So for me, I have to like be mentally ready to kind of get up on stage. And once I'm on stage, I'm fine. I think that if you take out the HRV issues, the poor sleep, and the altitude, generally I pretty easily I do deep breathing exercises before I got on stage because I always get excited. I definitely one of those people, like I enjoy speaking on stage. I enjoy being able to present. But if I'm feeling like I'm a little edgy, I will really focus on my breath work, and that can be very, very helpful. Even box breathing, which I will readily admit that's like typically my go-to is just breathe in for 5, hold for 5, exhale for 5, and like doing that rhythmically like 4 or 5 times really can be helpful. But the other thing is, I almost always speak fasted, just because you really think about the ketones, and or I will use like some ketone IQ, which I know is behind you.
Oh yeah.
Sometimes those are things I will make advantage of because to me I'm just really clear, like very, very clear. I'm not thinking about a word. I'm not trying to find a word, and I'm in a stage of life where a lot of women at this stage of life can struggle to find words. Thankfully, that's not my issue. But I do find that if I'm speaking in the morning, I'm definitely 100% fasted. I may add in some exogenous ketones. If I'm speaking in the afternoon, I may or may not eat. It just depends again on how I'm feeling. I may just have something small, and then get up there and speak. And then there's always that release after you're done. You're like, phew, done. Now I can like focus, be present, talk to people. But I think so much of it is what are the confounding variables of what's going on. I know for me, and I'm sure you feel the same, you go to these events and you're spending 3 or 4 days around a lot of people, you're doing a lot of talking, it's easy to get dehydrated, you're not drinking as much. For me, I always feel like I need to recharge. So whether or not it's spending an hour in my hotel room just to kind of decompress, or sometimes passing on some social events if it's like the third or fourth night of going out, I think is certainly helpful. But I think for everyone, it's really finding like what works for you. And I know for me, I'm like a rubber band gets really stretched, and then I'm like, okay, I need to kind of I need to decompress, I need to like go to my room, I need to go listen to some music, I need to go for a walk, just kind of get out of my head, and then I feel like I'm definitely more grounded and centered.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and I've always kind of wondered, because you look at a lot of different careers or just things that could involve travel, and it's like maybe you're an athlete and you're traveling, or you're public speaking, or really just you're somebody and you're just like traveling for vacation and stuff like that, and like when you start getting those like big changes in HRV, and then if you're throwing a lot of those confounding things on like you're drinking and you're not eating like the best food, like it can just put you in this like state of like anxiety. I know that like the
Mhm.
first couple of times that I've never really had a problem with public speaking. Like it's never been really something that's really made me nervous. But I remember one of the first times that I actually traveled and like flew for public speaking, and before I really had any sort of like things in place, I would just like, and I didn't really know about breathing yet. And the breathing tips that you gave, that really is the best thing. Like,
Mhm.
I was out at a conference. We were at an HR conference with the BioCoach team in Nashville, and it was another one of those like short trips, like kind of flew out day of, had to give a presentation that night. And it was kind of a unique presentation where I didn't know about this until a few days before, but it was like 20 slides, and the slides like auto rotate like 30 seconds. So you
Oh
just have
no.
really have it like locked in. So I didn't have like, a ton of time to like practice it. I was kind of like a late addition to the lineup. And, I definitely like, I showed up, and it's a small event, like really not that many people, maybe like 100 people. And I really just felt like heart rate's beating fast,
Mhm.
like a lot of anxiety. And, fortunately I knew about the breathing and different breathwork tips to almost instantaneously bring it back down. Like it's crazy how fast that works. But like early on in my career, I didn't know about those things. And I remember just always feeling like I'd be like shaky on stage and like super anxious. And I would be wondering like, what's wrong with me? Like I've never had this problem before. Like it almost feels like a performance anxiety. And then as I started to learn more about it, it's like, oh yeah, you're going into this like very suboptimal, like you have poor sleep, you've just traveled, like you have all these things going on. So it really is important. And I think it does extend more practically to people, even if you're just on vacation. Like if you're traveling with like three kids on a vacation, like you don't want to feel super anxious and strung out and kind of on the edge where any little thing is going to like kind of push you over. I think everybody wants to kind of feel more calm. And that's why I think these tips that you give really make sense for anybody, not just for somebody who's like public speaking or anything like that.
Yeah, and it's funny. I think because of all the years in cardiology, I worked as an NP, the vagus nerve. So it's the
Yeah.
longest nerve in the body, it's the wanderer. Understanding how to stimulate it because it will slow your heart rate. We used to have a lot of patients that would stimulate it because they went to the bathroom or they got nervous. And so understanding that you can use it to your advantage, I think is really helpful. And for me, I can always tell when I'm feeling, a little bit of an adrenaline surge, because not only do I feel like I feel a little jittery, but my voice it isn't, I don't have the same tone or inflection in my voice. And so it's always trying to calm that, because I think the voice sometimes can be the tell. You
Yeah.
might be able to, hold it all together, but then like your voice will crack, or you'll hiccup, or there'll be something that your body is like trying desperately to help you slow everything down. So anything that stimulates the vagus nerve, so you can like gargle, you can hum. Obviously, if you're trying to do this discreetly, breathing is probably the easiest thing to do. But
Right.
there's a lot of different ways to stimulate that vagus nerve, but all things that are very helpful to kind of balance that autonomic nervous system.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's a great tip for everybody to take. And that can extend into, if you're giving a presentation at work, or anything like that, like things that, can maybe make you a little bit more nervous. You're going in having a conversation with your boss, asking for a raise or something like that, and you get really nervous in there. Like these little tips can be really good for kind of just giving you more confidence and helping you be a little bit more on point when you go in. One of the things that, kind of switching gears a little bit, that I really wanted to talk to you about today was, so, we've talked a lot about in the past about supplements and things. And, you're not really somebody that's like a huge pusher of supplements. You're kind of, I know you're a little bit more on like the holistic side of things. Like everybody gets a lot hung up in the health and wellness space about you need all these different things. But so whenever you do make a recommendation for a supplement, I'm always all ears on it, because I know that it's like, there's a reason why you're making this recommendation. And I saw that you guys, I think more recently, I'm not sure how long it's been out for, but you had launched the Inositol product, which I feel like more people are talking about now, but maybe there's not a ton of awareness about it. So I really want to get into that a little bit, because, I saw it, like I said, I saw it pop up and I'm like, Cynthia doesn't really do supplements. Going on here, this Inositol must be pretty good.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I think there's in the supplement industry, I think there's a lot of well-meaning people, but I think it can also be confusing, confounding. People are like, I have supplement fatigue. I don't know what to take. I don't know who to listen to. And so I made a very strategic decision in 2022 that up until that point, I had been white labeling, which for listeners is when a manufacturer allows you to use their product and you put your own label on it. And
Mhm.
that's what you do. But I wasn't able to customize anything. And so I was introduced to a company that I now co-brand supplements with. And there are a couple products that I've used over the last several years, but one of them is Myo-Inositol. So inositol is a type of sugar, not sugar like sucrose. That's not what we're talking about. But understanding that this particular type of inositol is very beneficial for many things. You'll see a lot of research in metabolic health, PCOS, infertility, et cetera, diabetes. But as an offshoot of that, it's also very helpful for and there's a lot of solid research on mood disorders. I just interviewed someone for the podcast because it's not my area of expertise. Clinical psychologists use a lot of it for OCD,
Mm.
anxiety and depression, some binge eating disorders. But what I started using it for was sleep support. And so it helps with sleep architecture. It helps with falling asleep more readily. It helps with staying asleep. And I can't think of any female I know north of 40 who, in some degree or another, irrespective of where they are, whether it's perimenopause or menopause, that isn't having some disruption of sleep quality, usually in the luteal phase when they're having these decreasing levels of progesterone. And so for me, I started using it as like a sleep stack. It's part of my sleep stack. And I'm very, very, very supportive of people supporting their sleep, because we know how important sleep is, both REM and deep sleep. And so for me, I started taking inositol over a year ago, and then I was doubling my deep sleep. And deep sleep seems to be the one aspect of sleep architecture that a lot of people struggle with. And so you can re-engineer, you can do all things. You can exercise and get light exposure and get in bed on time and all that sleep hygiene. But for many women in particular, it seems to really be a challenge. And I was doubling my REM and my deep sleep, which for me was huge. And so kind of evolved into there, but also understanding help with insulin sensitivity, which is huge. And so I have some of my patients that are taking it twice daily. They're taking it in the morning and they're taking it in the night. And it's very well researched. It's very safe to take. And so that was really like one of the first things that I decided when we were going to bring some supplements to market was, what is something, especially we know so many people are not metabolically healthy in the United States. What's something that can be very helpful and multifunctional? So like, I love efficiency. This goes back to, my traditional kind of medicine training. Like if something can treat or address multiple issues, that's fantastic. So the feedback that we've gotten, also helping with insulin sensitivity. And, on the other side of that is that there are other supplements like Berberine, and Berberine is fine, but it's kind of like hitting, your blood sugar with a sledgehammer as opposed to a regular hammer. For me, I think Myo-Inositol is better tolerated. It doesn't have these antimicrobial impact like Berberine does. And I just have found a lot of patients have done better with it. But things that can help with insulin sensitivity, that can help with sleep, that help with mood. Like we've had men and women reaching out and saying, my mood has lifted. And again, I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I do have someone coming on we have already recorded with. We have a podcast coming out next month where she
Mhm.
talks about the research that is actually well done research on the net impact on mood disorders. But sleep architecture. So people are like waking up in the middle of the night and they fall back to sleep readily. And then the blood sugar piece. And so for me, it's such an easy thing to kind of integrate. It dissolves into water, it dissolves into liquids pretty readily. And so I'm really proud of it because I look at it as it's just one ingredient and it has so many net benefits. And so you can obviously start with 1 gram and you can work your way up if you feel like you need more. But a really easy way to support not only metabolic health, brain health, sleep support, which are really big issues for a lot of people. It's not just women, but I find for both men and women, they're getting a lot of benefit from something so simple as Myo-Inositol. I always have to clarify. The bag says inositol because we thought it was going to, it's hard to pronounce. We're trying to make it as easy as possible. But this particular form of inositol is the one in clinical studies that has all these benefits.
Got it. And so when you're taking it, because there's kind of this wide variety of application for it. What is your like for you personally? What's your like supplement protocol with it? Are you taking it like in the morning, and then are you taking it like before bed, or to get that sleep benefit? Do you need to take it right before bed, or what's the protocol there?
Yeah, so I usually take mine in the evening, like the tail end of my feeding window, because it's not going to make you fall asleep. That's always the question. I said it'll make you feel
Right.
relaxed. It is not going to make you fall asleep. That's always the concern. For
Yeah.
me, because I'm not taking it for improvement in insulin sensitivity, but I am taking it for that sleep piece. And I do find, especially I have teenagers, so some nights, we have, nights where I have to stay up really late because I don't go to bed till the teenagers are home. For me, I can sit downstairs and maybe watch a movie with my husband or go out to dinner with him and come home, and I can stay up till 11, or that's when they're supposed to be home.
Yeah.
But obviously, I'm staying up a little later and I'm not falling asleep. So,
Good.
for me, it's worked in that it's not like melatonin or oral progesterone, which I know probably many of the middle-aged people are taking those things where it will make you fall asleep
Mhm.
if you're not careful. This is definitely not that way. It's used it's kind of mechanism of action is it's kind of a gentle support. It's not something, again, remember I talked about the sledgehammer
Yeah.
versus the regular hammer. It's more like a regular hammer.
Interesting. And then what is the on kind of like the insulin sensitivity side of things? Do you kind of familiar with like the mechanism of action there? Like is it compared to like a berberine and how it's actually working? How is the inositol affecting insulin sensitivity?
Yeah, so it's actually helping with the pancreas. And so when we're thinking about just to kind of like think about, we've got blood sugar. We've got glucose in our bloodstream. It's helping the cells. So it's actually helping at the cellular level to make the cells more receptive to the mechanism of action of the insulin. So, on a very kind of basic science level, it's not as complicated as some of these new, we were just talking about semaglutide and GLP-1
Right.
agonists. It's not as sophisticated as that, but we know that our bodies have the ability to create myo-inositol on their own. We can get a little bit from our diet, but we're adding additional options to help with that insulin sensitivity. But definitely mitochondrial receptivity, definitely cellular input and influx of insulin helping to bring the glucose into the cell. So very, very basic, not nearly as complicated as a lot of a lot of the drugs that are out there, but definitely one that I think from the level of understanding that it's designed to be, pretty readily and easily, except I haven't had anyone who's had problems with blood sugar dysregulation, meaning their blood sugar is going too low, which I've had with
Mm.
patients with berberine. And berberine is a great supplement. I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying that it's a little more gentle and it's a little bit more predictable. And that's why I prefer using that over some other agents.
Got it. And then so for using it for that use case, is this something that you could like take before like say a higher carbohydrate meal to kind of manage your blood glucose spike, or is this more of like a kind of like throughout the whole day you're going to see improvements in glucose regulation by taking this as a supplement?
That's a great question. So, for patients of mine who have PCOS, we start with 1 gram twice a day. So, one scoop is 1 gram to give you a sense.
Mhm.
And so, what I find is it's helpful. It has like an extended release without, being able to say, like, the peak efficacy is at a certain hour. I don't honestly know that offhand, but it seems to be helpful throughout the day. So, peak efficacy is probably 6 hours in, is my guess.
Okay.
Meaning that's the point at which it's going to really be most efficacious. I actually haven't tried it. I did put a CGM on today because I was going to try this myself. Ironically enough, I was going to try to see as I carb cycle, what's my pre and post blood sugar response without inositol, and then on a higher carb day, what is it with inositol? So that was one of my reasons for. I just had a branding photo shoot last weekend, and I could not have walked around with a CGM on my arm
Yeah.
for a lot of different reasons, but that's definitely something I'm going to be experimenting with this weekend. I just bought a bunch of like sweet potatoes and raspberries and blueberries and things like that, and actually some bananas to kind of do some tests to see what the net impact on my blood sugar is. So I can definitely report back. I would say it's going to be the power of the N of one,
Yeah.
but there's definitely some idea about utilizing myo-inositol with my clients and having them do some experimentation, and then from there, seeing what else we can do. Because I think one of the things I probably need to start doing more of is documenting the clinical response. Like, we get people sharing their verbal responses, their written responses, but getting more granular about what's the net benefit. Like, if you take myo-inositol prior to a carbohydrate dense meal and you're going to eat your carbs naked, as Glucose Goddess likes to
Mm.
say, you're going to eat your carbs naked as opposed to clothed. What's going to be the net impact if you use a product like myo-inositol before versus not taking anything, and being able to compare both of those, I think would be interesting.
Yeah, that's where my mind always goes on, thinking about berberine or inositol or any of these different ingredients that can have some impact on blood sugar, is like whether it's an acute thing or if it's kind of more of like a, over the course of a full day. Because I think there's a lot of really interesting use cases for that. Like, obviously if you can, if you're somebody who you're in a bind, or you eat a food that you'd rather not have, or maybe you're intentionally kind of having like a cheat meal, you could maybe use this as something to kind of buffer that, kind
Mm-hmm.
of reduce the impact of it. But then thinking about it a little bit more like on the like muscle building side of things, like if we can more efficiently drive glucose into our cells, whether it's before a workout or after a workout, maybe that would be better for, being able to help build muscle. Or, one of the things I always think about for athletes who are kind of more glucose dominant, who are, using carbohydrates as fuel, is that, if you're burning a lot of carbohydrates for fuel, well, twofold on it. Like, for one, if you're eating a lot of carbohydrates, you're going to have these like larger spikes in blood sugar. And then, sometimes if you're, not as insulin sensitive, that blood sugar is going to, or that sugar is going to stay in the blood for longer. And then what's the impact on that, right? Like, now are you, setting yourself up for maybe some like endothelial issues, some cardiovascular issues from kind of having that high blood sugar for too long. So like I've always I have a lot of curiosity around this because there's a lot of different applications for these things. I know with like berberine, I've done some testing with berberine, and it seems like, I personally haven't noticed a massive like acute like, oh, take berberine before. Like I remember the first time I ever took berberine, it was I was in grad school, and me and some of my buddies wanted to do. There was like in Tampa, there was this like pizza challenge that like nobody had ever beat. It was like this big like I forget how big the pizza was, but it was like you and two of your buddies could go try to eat it, and they wanted me to participate in it because I have pretty big appetite. I can eat a lot of food. I'm like, all right, I'll do it, but like, I don't know, like, I don't really love the blood sugar spike I'm going to get from this. And back then, I was also probably a little bit more like, I was a little bit more, I won't say strict, but I was a little bit more bothered by the idea of being kicked out of ketosis than I am now. I was a little bit earlier in my journey, so I was like, oh, I'm going to take berberine before, and I did, and it didn't do anything, but also the amount of carbohydrates that I had was way past, that being able to probably help at all. But I've tried it in other situations too, and I haven't really noticed that berberine will have a dramatic reduction of the glucose from a meal, like from a higher carbohydrate meal. But there's plenty of other benefits to it. Obviously, like we know that it has, some kind of more like longer term potential benefits and effects it can have. But yeah, I'll be really curious. Like, would love to hear what you see on that front. I might have to grab some as well and give it a try. It's one of those supplements that's been kind of on my radar for a while, but I haven't really had the time to dive in and take a look at the research on it. So I'll have to give it a try myself and see if I can get any good experimental data to go with your N of one stuff.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I have friends and colleagues, like our mutual friend Megan Ramos used
Yeah.
berberine and actually got quite sick.
Oh yeah.
Ended up in the hospital, I think, with metabolic alkalosis. And I mean,
Wow.
that is a and she talks openly about this, so I'm not sharing anything that she
Yeah.
hasn't shared publicly. But I think that's an extreme. But I also think people also sometimes will use berberine as like they can eat anything. And
Right. Right.
I'm more of the belief system that if you're having 60, 70, 80, 100 grams of carbs in a meal, I don't think anything per se is going to necessarily help buffer that carbohydrate load versus if you have, 20 or 30 grams or even 40 in a meal, I think your body can buffer that pretty efficiently depending on who you are as an individual.
Right.
But I think the other thing about berberine that I just mentioned is, for each one of us, berberine has other benefits. It's used as a potent antimicrobial, so sometimes it's part of um, you know uh, it's part of protocols to kill off things that don't belong, whether it's a dysbiosis or a bacteria that doesn't belong in the gut microbiome. And so I remind people that die off can drive some unpleasant symptoms, gas and bloating. The one time I used it as part of a protocol in conjunction with my functional medicine doc, at the time I was way before the tail end of perimenopause, but it gave me hot flashes like after a couple days, and it was because it was dropping my blood sugar significantly at night, and I was waking up like sweating. I was like, oh my gosh, what the heck's going on? Until I realized what was happening. And so I think, like anything, just being cautious. And I'm sure there are lots of people out there listening that do fine with berberine, and that's great. But that's why it's so helpful to kind of individually get an assessment of whether or not something works well for you or doesn't. I think using it PRN, like my husband uses it as needed around carbohydrate dense meals. Like if he makes pizzas with the kids,
Yeah.
he'll take it with that. And I always laugh because I'm like, I'm not sure how much that's doing, but if it makes you feel better mentally to do it, then that's all good.
Yeah. Well, I'll definitely have to get some, and I'll do some experiments. So for everybody listening, you can kind of be on the lookout, and we can maybe get some follow ups from Cynthia on what kind of stuff she's seeing with her CGM using it. One of the other supplements I saw that you're selling, which is I'm very, it's one of those few. A lot of people have heard me talk about. It's one of the supplements that I recommend everybody take. I've been taking it since I was a kid, for much different reasons than what I take it for now. But I saw that you also have creatine, which I think this was one that I really want to talk about because I think there's so many misconceptions around creatine, not only on like the use of it, like, what to use it for, what benefits you can experience, but then also the safety of it. I know like when I was a kid, I remember, I'll never forget, and I've probably told the story on the podcast before, but I remember I was in high school, and there was like a kid in a neighboring town that played football, and he was really big, like super jacked. And everybody was saying that he was like taking steroids because he was like taking creatine. And everybody thought the creatine was like a steroid. And then I remember getting into college and, starting to hear more like because I played sports in college, some trainers and more people were talking about creatine, but then there was this idea that like, oh, creatine's bad for your kidneys, it's bad for your liver, like you don't want to take it. And then as I started kind of, getting a little bit older and really researching it, kind of came across like, okay, one, this is like, there's no other sports supplement that's been researched as much as creatine monohydrate. It has like one of the best safety profiles out there. And then kind of getting to the now not realizing like, oh, this isn't just muscle building, there's like all these benefits associated with it. So I think creatine is something that everybody needs to know about, and fortunately more people are talking about it. But you're obviously big on it because you're offering creatine as well. So what kind of led to you offering creatine as a supplement, and what's kind of your major use cases there?
Yeah, so we have two mutual friends who kind of put it on my radar. Gabrielle Lyon and Kristen Rowell kind of both said to me separately, "You really need to look at this." And I was like, "Oh no, that's bro science," because that
You're
was my bias. My bias at that time, because I remember 20 years ago when you saw people that were probably using anabolic steroids. They were doing massive loading doses, 20, 30, 40 grams of creatine. I can't even imagine how bloating that would be. And so, really looking at that information and saying, okay, that's very different. Understanding that, as you stated, it is one of the most well researched ergogenic supplement aids that's out there. And then really looking at the research on women in particular, because women make 70 to 80% less creatine endogenously in their bodies. So that's number one. Like, we actually can't get enough from our diet, because that's what I'll hear from people. I'm just going to eat more steak. And I'm like, that's great. Eat more steak. However, you can't make we're at a disadvantage. And you think about during a woman's menstrual cycle, there are times when she needs more creatine monohydrate. And then you think about women north of 40 who are at greatest risk for sarcopenia, men too, but women, it's a more exaggerated response because of the net impact of these changes in sex hormones, et cetera. And so looking at women in perimenopause and menopause, we need more protein, we need more creatine. And
Mhm.
so it really stemmed genuinely from my own knowledge of learning about why it was important for me to be taking it. And then realizing, even as a 51-year-old woman, I could go to the gym and I was consistently every week lifting, even if it was 10 pounds more, I was lifting more weight. And so it's harder to build and maintain weight as we get older. Sarcopenia is a real thing. And so understanding metabolically what's happening in our bodies with this loss of muscle mass and the loss of insulin signaling. For me, the first reason why I took it was to help kind of halt that and be able to build and maintain muscle.
Mhm.
And then I didn't realize that it has sleep support things. It has, brain health and cognition. I've had people say to me, patients, I don't know how to explain this, but I feel clearer mentally. And
Mhm.
so that dove me down this big rabbit hole of trying to understand what is the research dose for women, what is the research dose for men, and then vegans and vegetarians. Because if you're a vegan or vegetarian, you can't get enough in your diet, period, because you're not eating animal protein. They need more. So men need more. Vegans and vegetarians need 5 grams a day as a starting point, and then most other women 3 grams a day. And understanding you don't have to load it, that you
Mhm.
can start with that. And I found that women really tolerate it very well. And so again, it goes back to this decision that I wanted to make sure supplements were multifaceted, but I didn't even realize fully the brain and neurological benefits of creatine monohydrate. And then, compound that with, just depending on where we are life stage wise, it can really be of tremendous benefit. My 15-year-old and my 17-year-old also take it. And, there was a lot of research that had to go into making sure this was safe for them to take because they're still growing. My 15-year-old has put on 20 pounds of muscle. I don't think it's just related to creatine. I think that has helped, but he's been consistently lifting weights and being very diligent about his protein and his carbohydrates and all these things, which I think that's admirable. But I
Mhm.
think for like your listeners, it's really understanding that it's not just bro science. It's not just wanting to get big muscles. It's really understanding that metabolically, this can be an adjunct to other good lifestyle decisions. And I'm all about, like, I hate the word hack, but I like supplements that help multiple things in the body,
Yeah.
because I like to pare things down. I like to keep things simple. And to me, it's multifaceted. So if it helps with your sleep and it helps with muscle health, and it helps with, sleep architecture too, as a byproduct. And if you don't believe me, Huberman Lab has great content around this. I always say, like, I do my own research and then I'm like, what did Huberman Lab have to say about it? Because I'll go to see if there's some study that I wasn't aware of. And so that definitely has kind of reinforced that. So I have to give credit to Dr. Gabrielle Lyon and Kristen Rowell, who are friends of ours, to say they put it on my radar. And then I started using it and I was very humbled. Like truly, like I'll say my prejudice against it was unfounded, but now I know better. So I like to be able to say, like, I started from a place of really not knowing enough to now I'm in a place where I'm like, this is actually something that people can safely use. And nearly every day I get people saying, is creatine creatinine? And I'm like, no, those are two different things. One is a measure
Oh,
of
right.
kidney function. Creatine is an actual product, something that our body does make. Men have more of it endogenously, women have less. Just important to kind of point out those gender differences, because women sometimes will say to me, I don't want to get big. I'm like, this is not anabolic steroids. This is not
No.
going to make you big. It's not the mechanism of action. That will not happen.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I didn't know the point about women making like 40% less. I didn't realize that. I had assumed that there would be a greater demand for women just by way of maybe not being able to eat as much of, like animal protein and stuff to get in enough from your diet. But I didn't realize that that women actually make less of it. And I think you're right. Like in terms of like, if you have to pick a handful, we all have budgets that we're trying to operate within, like us, and not everybody can take, if you listen to some of these podcasts, like I know there was a point in my life where I went deep down the rabbit hole and there was just like I wanted to
Mhm.
take 50 different supplements because every one of them is really cool and exciting and all this stuff. But if you really kind of break it down into like some of the core things that are great to take, like creatine is one of those ones I think everybody should be on. And like you said, it's not going to you're not going to look like a bodybuilder the day after you take creatine. But what is interesting on it is that there's these long-term benefits that you get from them. You brought up some of like the cognitive things can be great for, keeping your brain healthy as you're aging. But there's also a lot of these really acute benefits, both on the performance and on the muscle building side, that I think is really interesting. Like for muscle build or for working out, I guess I should say, if you take creatine before you go to the gym, you definitely feel stronger immediately. Like you will feel like you have like I do 5 grams before I go to the gym,
Mhm.
5 grams of creatine before the gym. You will feel stronger than if you didn't have 5 grams before. And that is going to translate to you, like, one, feeling better during your workout, two, being able to lift a little bit more weight, push yourself a little bit more. You're going to get better adaptations. That's great. But then the other one on the brain side, which I agree, that was the side I had no idea about
Mhm.
until the last couple of years, and it's been really exciting. I came across a study a few months ago that was actually looking at acute cognitive function after a poor night's sleep, and it was showing that creatine can increase your cognitive performance after you go through a night of not getting great sleep. Which, as a newer parent, was I have in my supplement routine. So what is your dosing? You mentioned the gram amount. What is the timing of the day that you recommend people? Is this kind of one of those also where just get it in at any time, or is it better before or after a workout? Or if you're trying to use it for sleep, is it better to take around your sleep window, or what's your approach?
Yeah. So the first question I typically get asked is, does it break a fast? Technically, yes. But if you are metabolically healthy, don't split, like, don't lose sleep literally over that. I like to take it in the morning. I usually will break my fast with a shake because I can get all of these things in it. And again, remember I said I like efficiency. I have to take less things throughout the day. So I will take mine in the morning at the point at which I'm breaking my fast. But I think the best answer is take creatine when it's easiest to remember to take creatine. Like I can put it in my water. So if I don't have a smoothie that day, I can just put it in my water and I'll add some lemon and that's great. Like that works really well. It blends effortlessly. Not all creatines are crystallized that way. They sometimes will cloud up the water. I don't know about you, but I like to not have cloudy water
Yeah.
if I can at all manage that. So I think it's really taking it when you can remember to take it is like rule number one. So don't stress about it. But for me personally, I just take it in my water or I take it in a shake because it's convenient. It's all about convenience for me. Now my 15-year-old has to go quite a ways to go to his high school. So when I pick him up in the afternoon, that's usually when he'll have his before his workout, because much to your point, he feels like it allows him to be a little more intense in his exercise, and being a guy, that's important to him. And
Mhm.
so we kind of chuckle about this because he's like, you don't take it before your workouts. And I was like, no, but that's also because I work out early in the morning And I'm usually just focused on electrolytes and whatever it is I'm doing. So I think it really comes down to like personal preference and what's going to be easiest to do. And the other thing that I remind people is it's best to take creatine consistently. So sometimes people will say, "Well, I didn't lift that day, so it's not important." And I was like, "Well, actually it's better to be consistent with your consumption of this because it does have net benefits even on days you're not lifting heavy, because the days we aren't lifting are actually days that we're having more, muscle improvement and, growth, because we're giving our muscles a little bit of a rest. And so I think it's important to kind of point that out, because I think there's a lot of women will say, "Oh, I take it 3 days a week." And I'm like, actually, you could take it more. But if it's easier for you just to take it on the days that you lift, then do it that way. It's all about sustainability. Because if you end up, I've learned just from prescribing medications and supplements and things like that, it has to be what is feasible and reasonable for an individual. If like having to time it at a different time of the day isn't going to allow them to be compliant, then do what works best for you and your schedule.
Yeah, no, I like that. I think it's, doing it in the morning, I think is a great
Mhm.
strategy. Like a lot of times it doesn't have flavor, so it's really easy to add to a shake or anything like that. There's also capsules out there, but you do typically have to take a lot of capsules to get the
Mhm.
amount that you would want to get. I'm assuming, is it creatine monohydrate that you're selling?
Yes. Yes,
Yeah,
it's creatine monohydrate, and our product is just creatine monohydrate. And I do
nice.
agree with you. The capsules, like for me, it's easy to do a little scoop in something and then you're done with it. But to have to swallow, 8 capsules of something is not. I think for most people, it's not cost effective, and most people don't want to swallow all those supplements just to be able to get that therapeutic dose down.
Yeah, for sure. And for anybody that's kind of into the creatine different types, I know like when I was going through grad school, there was all these different creatines that were coming on the market, and it was really exciting. And I think a lot of it has just been a ploy to make people pay more for creatine, because it's a really affordable supplement. It's not super expensive. Probably one of the best bang for your buck supplements that you can take. But don't get hung up in the different types. Creatine monohydrate is the one that has the most research behind it. It has the most safety behind it. We know that it works really well. So any of the other ones out there, I think that you're probably just paying more money for something that's not necessary. So yeah, I think creatine monohydrate is the way to go. So talking about, we talked a little bit about, kind of the impact of creatine and inositol, both on some of these different factors like sleep and metabolic health. And I think it's really interesting that like, it's kind of unique that there's these supplements out there that impact both of those two things simultaneously. And to me, I think that's a highlight of the impact that like our sleep and metabolic health have on each other, kind of going both ways. Like our sleep impacts our metabolic health impacts our sleep. So it's kind of funny that as you're going through the benefits of these two amazing products, that we're seeing kind of both of these two things come up as potential benefits there. So I know this has kind of been a topic that you've been a little bit more on lately. I've definitely been more on the sleep side of things lately because it's first time in my life that I've been challenged in this area. It's always been, I used to be had my awesome night routine and let's get 8 hours of sleep and wake up without an alarm and feel super refreshed. And it looks a little different now with the kid. So yeah, I'm just curious to kind of get like your side of it on the sleep metabolic health relationship. What's going on there?
Yeah, and it's such a good point. And to reassure you that just when you think you've got the sleep piece nailed down, having kids, then they start staying up later than you.
Yeah.
And then they start staying out later than you. And then your sleep is all kerfuffled all over again. So, like
Yes.
Friday and Saturday nights, I'm struggling to stay awake because I'm in bed so much earlier during the week. And my kids think it's funny, but I'm like, I can't sleep till you're home. But when
Right.
we're talking about the interrelationship between metabolic health and sleep, it's helpful for people to understand that within our body, we have circadian clocks, and it's not just the pineal gland in the brain. We've got them throughout the digestive system. And, there are, like many hormones in the body, there's opposing hormones. So melatonin is a hormone that's very sensitive to darkness. We have cortisol that is very sensitive to light, and vice versa. And so when we wake up in the morning, our body is supposed to intrinsically start suppressing melatonin, increasing cortisol, and we have a circadian rhythm that goes on throughout the day. Our cortisol levels should be highest in the morning, they ebb and flow throughout the day, and then they're supposed to be lowest at night. And so ideally, as we are exposed to more and more darkness, we'll start secreting more and more melatonin, as well as some other hormones in the body. But in our kind of modern day lifestyles, when we are exposed to blue light, we're under lights, the advent of electricity, as wonderful as it is impacted when we're eating and how much we're eating. And so the recognition that, as an example, if we eat a meal very close to bedtime, so let's say you go to bed at 10, you eat at 9 o'clock, you are signaling in the body as this food bolus is coming through. Your body is saying, okay, we need to suppress melatonin. We need to increase cortisol because we have this food bolus. And that can disrupt sleep. There are many things that obviously disrupt sleep, but understanding that when we get a poor night of sleep, whether it's because of stress, whether it's because of alcohol, late night meals, just depending if you're a woman, where you are in your menstrual cycle, can all be very disruptive. It impacts our ability to control our blood sugar. It impacts satiety and appetite hormones like leptin and ghrelin. And there are a lot of studies that demonstrate that if you get less than 6 hours a night of sleep, you have greater degrees of blood sugar dysregulation. You have less appetite and satiety signaling that goes on. When you wake up in the morning, you're not going to feel as rested. You're very likely going to crave exactly the foods that are going to set off this hormonal cascade to further dysregulate glucose, insulin signaling, etc. If your cortisol's up because you're chronically, so imagine you go to bed, you're stressed, you wake up in the middle of the night, you're stressed, cortisol goes up, glucose goes up, insulin goes up in a response to try to bring things back down. And so I remind people that if you are not sleeping through the night consistently, that is going to adversely impact metabolic health because you're not going to be able to have as much insulin sensitivity. You're very likely going to be consuming the types of foods that are going to further dysregulate your blood sugar and contribute to, insulin resistance. And so I always like to say there's this chronic interplay between the circadian signaling and chronobiology, and there's the suprachiasmatic nucleus that is kind of the master clock of the entire body. And that can very easily be dysregulated because of sleep, stress, travel, hormonally where you are, et cetera. Types of foods, if they're highly inflammatory, if you're drinking a lot of alcohol, and I hate to keep kicking alcohol, but I'm going to just use that as an example. But this sometimes is the only time that people will say, like, I had a couple glasses of wine, or I had a few martinis, or I had couple daiquiris and I fell asleep pretty easily. And then I woke up and I was sweating and I didn't feel good. And then the next day I'm eating, like the joke used to be in college that when you had a bad night of sleep and you were hungover, you go look for greasy food. Well, greasy food is probably the antithesis of what your body actually needs to kind of get your blood sugar better controlled. So I think it's helpful for people to understand that sleep is foundational. And so figuring out why your sleep is not as supported and certainly not as good as you would like it to be is really at the foundation for metabolic health. Like I always tell people, if you can't get you to sleep through the night, I can't get you to lose weight. So really understanding that it has to be a priority. High quality sleep needs to be a priority. Some of it's not sexy. I sleep with blue blockers before I go to bed. I've got a sleep mask. I mean, the room is cold. My husband's got acclimated to 65-degree temps at night. My whole family sleeps really well, but understanding there are things that are going to help induce sleep quality, which is going to improve overall metabolic health. Even having, like, taking a hot bath, we know based on study research that warming your body up can help kind of speed this process of where your body, like, you'll ultimately drop your temperature, and that will help induce sleep. But there are a lot of things that you can do, hacks that you can do, supplements you can take that can all be beneficial. But I always say, if you're not sleeping through the night and you're insulin resistant or not metabolically healthy, that's the first piece of the puzzle that you have to figure out. Really important.
Yeah, and I feel like it's oftentimes kind of a put on the back burner. And I've always been a proponent of, like, if you focus on diet, that's going to be, 80%, 80-20 rule. That's going to kind of make the biggest difference. But sleep really is one of those ones. I mean, I was kind of blown away looking at the research on sleep and how just like one night of bad sleep can dramatically affect your insulin sensitivity the next day. And then if you pair that with, like you mentioned, you have more hunger, more cravings, the foods that you choose to put in your bodies that next day is going to be worse. So now it's like you're kind of hitting it twofold. And this can just be kind of a cyclical thing where, because sleep is one of those things where a lot of it's, when I post content on sleep, it's often, there'll be a lot of people that'll drop comments in there about, kind of like, oh, it's not a big deal, or getting like defensive on it because, admittedly, some people are just in situations where getting good sleep is hard. But I think what's important for everybody to note that, even if you're not like, you have the perfect scenario where maybe you can't actually get, like, there are people out there who can't necessarily get 8, 9 hours a night. They don't have the ability to, because of their job, they don't have the ability to like remove themselves from like, blue light and technology a couple hours before bed. But regardless of what your situation is, I think sleep is one of the times where biohacking is like the most beneficial. There are plenty of tools and resources out there that you can use to optimize whatever your situation is. Even if you're a night shift worker, if you're somebody that has to work late at night, you're having to stay up because your kids aren't home, whatever it is that your situation, you have to eat late at night just because you got home from work at 8 and that's just what you have to do. There's always something you can do to kind of counteract that. And I think you brought up a couple great ones like wearing blue light blockers, sleeping with a cool temperature, using a sleep mask or blackout curtains, I think are big ones. Even using like one of the things that I kind of developed some bad work habits early on as a new father, just by way of wanting to spend more time with my kid during the day. So doing a little bit more work at night and then having a hard time unplugging. But I started using things like binaural beats before bed to kind of induce these different flow states in the mind that will help me kind of calm down and get ready for bed. So there's a lot of different things that you can do. And I think, as you pointed out, it's something that you have to focus on. Even if you can just make a 10% improvement, and you'll notice a difference too. Like I kind of recently went through, like I said, first year and a half of being a dad, just wasn't getting good sleep, burning the candle at both ends, going to bed at midnight, waking up at 4:30 to play basketball in the morning and thinking I was fine. Right. Going into podcasts with not much rest. And then probably like the last 2 months, I was like, all right, something has to give here. I really need to get, like, I can't be sleeping 5 hours a night. And even just making the jump from like 5 hours to 6 hours for me,
Mm-hmm.
crazy difference on everything. Like I was going into the gym, I was lifting more weight than I was lifting before. I felt more like in conversation. I felt like I had better flow, like my memory recall was better. Playing sports like basketball and softball, I felt like I had better hand-eye coordinate. Like everything was so much better just from that little 20% improvement of getting that extra hour. And I thought I was fine. I think a lot of people listening to this would probably say the same thing, where you don't notice that you're at a deficit until you experience what better is, and then you realize that you were performing suboptimally, but you just didn't know it. So on that front, on the sleep side of things, you mentioned some of like the different sleep hacks that you have. Do you have any recommendations for somebody that's, say, a night shift worker? Because that's the one that we get like the most kind of pushback from people, where they'll say, like, well, I'm a night shift worker. I can't do anything, right? There's nothing I can do to fix this. But I don't know if that's necessarily the case. So I don't know if you've worked with anybody that's had this, but what would you say to somebody like that?
Yeah. So as someone that worked night shift
Oh,
as
you
an
did,
ER
right?
nurse
Yeah,
and as a nurse practitioner, I am acutely sensitive to this question.
yeah.
I have helped hundreds of healthcare providers to intermittent fast around night shift because
Mm,
they kind of train your body into having a meal before you go in. You fast for the 12 hours that you're working, and then you go home and you maybe have a meal and you go to bed. I think that if we really look at the research on night shift workers, we know that they're at a disadvantage in terms of interrupting that circadian biology and our chronobiology. They're at greater risk for metabolic disorders. They're at greater risk for certain types of cancers. And so I think it really speaks to how much sleep gets disrupted and how much we forget that during sleep, things like the glymphatic system get upregulated to get rid of disordered and entangled proteins and things that don't belong. It's almost like a toilet for the brain, and it requires so much energy. It really can only be harnessed when we're at sleep. So, helping people understand that there are alternatives to working night shifts. So that's number one. There are options. If you are choosing to work night shift, maybe you're having a buffer in between your night shifts. I used to work 3 in a row, and I don't know how I survived.
wow.
Because by that morning, that third morning, I would go home. I don't even know how I drove home. I was so tired. But I think for a lot of people, it's like, how can we work with the constraints in which you are in? So number one, having the option to switch to day shift or even an evening shift. Number two, not doing these sequential days in a row, which is very hard on the body. Number three, it can be transitioning out of the environment you're in. It might be that you still work for the hospital, but maybe you're working in a different environment. Maybe you're working in the PACU. That's where a lot of ER nurses went after getting really burned out being in the ER and working really long, stressful shifts. They would go to the PACU. So
Mhm.
I think that you have to have a lengthy discussion with yourself. I think you have to have some lab work to give you a sense of where you are metabolically. I think this is very important. This is where I would sit down with people and I would say, okay, this is what we see and this is what's happening. And so I want to be very supportive because there are a lot of people. You might not be a healthcare provider, you might be a cop, you might be a sanitation engineer, you could be someone that has to work overnight in a store that needs to be open overnight. So I think that understanding that in that unfed state, you can keep yourself really well hydrated. Maybe you have some, plain coffee and some tea that can help with caffeine, but understanding that you can eat before your shift and then you can eat when you get home. But trying to kind of maintain as much as possible some degree of normalcy, or maybe you're not working 12-hour shifts, maybe you get it down to 11 to 7, which is seemingly, for some reason, that extra 4 hours was always brutal. But sometimes you can maybe switch your hours a little bit so that maybe you're working in the evening, or maybe you're taking a nap and then going into work, and then it's a whole lot easier to stay up all night. But it is the research is pretty solid in this area. And of course, I want to be sensitive to listeners if they fall within those parameters, but understanding that there are little things that you can do. But I think that sleep quality piece is important. I think taking melatonin so that you can sleep is going to be important. I think years ago we used to take Benadryl, which was useless. That never helped me sleep. We say, oh, it'll cross the blood-brain barrier, it'll be great. Well, no, not really. It wasn't particularly helpful because I'd still wake up 4 hours later and be wide awake. So I think that
Right.
it's with that growing awareness that there are occupations that have to be working overnight, getting rest, on the days that you are, working sequentially. So making sure maybe you sleep for 4 hours, you wake up, and maybe you go back to bed, but trying your hardest to try to get high quality sleep as much as possible. And then the other piece of it is, we talked about this autonomic nervous system and helping to balance the parasympathetic and the parasympathetic and sympathetic. And so doing things that are, grounding work, meditation. We talked about stimulating the vagus nerve. Maybe you've got a PMF mat. Maybe you just connect with nature. I just did a Reels the other day that hasn't yet been published, but it was talking about forest bathing or getting out in nature is so soothing to the autonomic nervous system, really getting you out of that fight or flight sympathetic, getting you into the parasympathetic. And so finding ways that are going to support your body. And it's not woo woo, there's actual science on this, really very beneficial and helpful to do. So I think those are the things I probably would focus on the most. And the other piece of that I would add is not diving into temptation. If you're hungry, eat, but don't eat the donuts, don't eat the candy bar, don't go have a slushie or a Slurpee. Eat some protein, whether it's some chicken, some fish, some steak, leftovers, whatever it is. If you're going to eat, don't eat the stuff that is going to further dysregulate your blood sugar and impact insulin sensitivity. I think that's super important.
Yeah. No, I like that. I think that's exactly what I was kind of looking to tee up for the listeners, because yeah, it's one of those things where it's effort just like anything else, just like
Mhm.
dialing in your diet, working out, anything that you want, like getting better at a goal. It's something that requires effort. And some people are at a disadvantage just by way of what their lifestyle is, like what their career is, what their situation is at home, whatever it is. But no matter where you're kind of at, there's something you can do to get better in that area. Aiming for perfect may not be the thing. Like, I know that I don't think it's going to be years before I'm back to the pre-kid days of, like, the full 2 hour before routine and all of this type of things. But there's still, that's not an excuse to, like, for me, I know that I just abandoned everything for a period of time. There was like, oh, if I can't do it perfect, then why do anything at all? And that's a poor way to look at it. I think if you find the things that you can do, whether it's, fixing your food around your sleep, fixing your use of technology, all these different things. If you can just focus on one of those things, you're going to make improvements that I think will make a really big difference. Well, Cynthia, I really appreciate you coming on and giving us some insight here. I know this is the second or third time I think that we've had you on the show, but each
Yeah.
time you come on, there's some unique piece of information that we're able to cover. And it was really cool to get your breakdown of creatine and inositol today. I think that, like, those are two supplements that everybody should have on their radar. Highly recommend that everybody check them out on your website. Where can everybody go to learn more about those supplements, and to learn more about you and everything else that you're doing?
Well, thank you, Chris. It's always a pleasure to connect with you, and for listeners to know that we spoke for 45 minutes before we
Yeah.
actually started recording. So we genuinely have a nice camaraderie.
Yes.
Easiest to go to my website. So www.cynthiathurlow.com. You can get access to my book, the supplements, Everyday Wellness podcast. And my podcast with Chris from last year was the #1 most downloaded podcast of the whole year. So that really speaks
Yes.
to the wonderful message that Chris brings to this platform. You can find me on Instagram. I'm also on Twitter. Be forewarned, sometimes I can be snarky. And I have a free Facebook group called Intermittent Fasting Lifestyle / my name. It's free. It's for men and women. It is private, but you're more than welcome to join there. And it's a very drama-free group where it's carefully moderated to avoid drama, but a nice place for people to ask questions. And I answer them myself. It's not my team, but it's a nice way to kind of get to know, my business and what we kind of do within the business to help support people in their health.
That's amazing. And we'll make sure to link to all of those things and, a drama-free Facebook group. That sounds nice. I didn't know there was many of those that existed still nowadays.
Yeah, it's funny. My team is in that group, just to help moderate, and every once in a while we have to, it's like two strikes, you're out. We give someone the benefit of the doubt once, and then if the behavior continues, I'm like, you're gone. I mean, like, we
Yeah.
don't. This is ridiculous. So, see you
Yeah.
later.
Well, that's great. I'm glad that you're able to create kind of a safe place for people to go and that don't have to deal with that. I know it's like it's really hard to get plugged in on social media sometimes because it can be so toxic in some areas, especially in the health and wellness space. You see a lot of that with a lot of different dogmatic opinions and such. But yeah, we'll make sure to link to all of that. Highly recommend that you guys go check out Cynthia's book. I'll also link to the last episode that we had her on where we actually spoke about the book a little bit. We didn't get a chance to talk about that at all on this episode, but she has a great book that is super informative on intermittent fasting. I think you guys will love as well. So, Cynthia, really appreciate you coming on, and definitely have you on for another episode.
Sounds good, Chris. Have a great day.
You too.